The Oscars don't just reward films, they canonize them. Winning Best Picture often freezes a movie in permanent prestige, and this tends to make criticism awkward instead of welcome. Many of these films aren't terrible. Instead, they're well made, influential, and even emotionally effective, but not all. This is why in this video, we'll talk about the 7 most overrated Oscar-winning films that everyone pretends to love. Let's get into it. Number 1, Crash. This is a movie that presents itself as brave, confrontational, and unafraid to look directly at racism. I remember thinking it was powerful the first time I saw it. That reaction makes sense considering that the film is loud about its intentions and wants you to feel like you're engaging with something important. Crash won Best Pictures because of its structure. Interlocking storylines crisscross Los Angeles, bringing together characters of different races, classes, and professions. The film positions itself as complex, morally ambiguous, and willing to show racism from every angle. No one is clean. No one is entirely evil. That framing made it feel sophisticated in 2005, especially compared to more straightforward message movies. But this is also where the problem starts. Crash reduces systemic racism to a series of personal misunderstandings and emotional collisions. Everyone is racist, everyone suffers, everyone learns something, and by the end, everyone is quietly forgiven. The film treats racism as just a shared human flaw instead of a system with power, history, and consequences. By flattening everything into individual prejudice, it avoids asking who benefits, who is harmed, and who remains accountable. The movie constantly substitutes structure with symmetry. If one character commits a racist act, they're soon given a moment of suffering or heroism to balance the scales. Trauma becomes a shortcut to growth, and pain is treated as proof of moral progress. The audience is rewarded not for sitting with discomfort, but for recognizing it and moving on. That's the key issue. Crash wants credit for acknowledging racism without committing to its reality. It frames injustice as something that can be resolved through emotional recognition rather than sustained change. The film doesn't challenge systems, it humanizes everyone equally, even when equality of blame makes no sense. I still believe Crash wanted applause for asking questions that it refuses to stay with. It gestures toward complexity, then rushes toward resolution. That urgency feels less like honesty and more like reassurance. I also believe people pretend to like Crash because disliking it feels morally suspicious. The film frames recognition as a virtue. It says if you see the racism, you're already absolved. Admitting the movie is shallow and can sound like denying the problem it gestures toward. It's easier to nod along than criticize it and get labeled a racist for that. Crash simplifies injustice into personal misunderstanding because in the history of the Oscars, comfort has always been rewarded over discomfort. And our next film was taken from Crash's page as it reframes racism as friendship. Number 2, Green Book. If there's one thing Green Book is, it's that it feels polite, safe, carefully agreeable. It's the kind of film that signals good intentions from the first scene and never seriously risks losing them. Watching it, you can almost feel the movie reassuring you that everything is going to be okay. And that reassurance is exactly why so many people embraced it. The film is widely praised for its performances, especially Mahershala Ali's, which is genuinely restrained and dignified. It's also praised for its old-school storytelling, a throwback to crowd-pleasing dramas built around unlikely friendships and tidy arcs. Add in a message of unity and personal growth, and it looks like the perfect Oscar package. However, it's also because it mistakes warmth for depth that Green Book is overrated. The story is framed predominantly through the experience of its white protagonist, Tony Lip, whose personal growth becomes the emotional center of the film. Racial conflict exists largely to facilitate his development. We aren't asked to understand racism as a system. We're asked to watch one man slowly become nicer. That framing matters. Structural racism is reduced to background texture, something that creates obstacles but never demands examination. The film consistently softens historical realities to preserve its feel-good arc. Hostility appears in neat, manageable bursts. Resolution arrives through bonding moments, shared meals, and mutual respect, as if dignity alone could smooth over decades of entrenched inequality. This is comfort cinema at its finest. The film reassures viewers that prejudice can be solved through proximity and goodwill, without challenging power, institutions, or complicity. It invites empathy, but on terms that never unsettle the audience. In that sense, Green Book isn't confrontational at all. It's soothing. The irony in all this is that the film presents itself as progressive while relying on one of the oldest narrative templates in American cinema. The white savior framing isn't aggressive or overt, but it's persistent. Even Dr. Shirley's pain, isolation, and cultural dislocation are filtered through how they affect Tony's understanding of the world. Green Book isn't hated, it's politely protected. I think people pretend to like Green Book because it feels polite to do so. It's agreeable, inoffensive, and emotionally tidy. Criticizing it risks being read as rejecting its message of unity. So saying it's nice becomes a stand-in for saying it's good, but that helps no one. The movie wins affection by sanding down complexity, and that's why it's remembered fondly, even as its ideas collapse under scrutiny. And this is why films that reassure like this keep winning instead of films that challenge. And this has been a recurring pattern, as decades before this, the Academy decided to award a film that dressed up suburban despair as profundity. Number 3, American Beauty. Back in 1999, American Beauty felt daring, honest, subversive. When it came out, it carried the thrill of a movie saying things other films wouldn't, or at least things they pretended not to see. Suburban life was exposed as empty, performative, and quietly suffocating, and the film positioned itself as a brutal critique of the American dream from the inside. It's still praised for that supposed honesty. The imagery became iconic almost instantly. Plastic bags drifting in the wind, rose petals filling the frame. The dialogue is sharp, quotable, and carefully calibrated to sound profound. At the time, it felt like adult cinema taking risks, and the Oscars treated it accordingly. The problem, however, is how much of that daring was surface level. American Beauty relies heavily on shock to create the illusion of depth. Voyeurism is framed as awakening. Transgression is treated as self-discovery. The film wants its comfort to stand in for insight, as if making the audience uneasy automatically means something important is being said. That approach hasn't aged well. What once read as provocative now feels hollow, especially in how the film handles its characters. Male dissatisfaction is elevated to philosophy, while female characters exist largely as symbols, obstacles, or punishments. Desire is romanticized when it's male, pathologized when it's female, and rarely interrogated beyond its aesthetic appeal. The film's moral compass is intentionally vague, but that vagueness starts to feel like avoidance rather than complexity. Nihilism is presented as wisdom. Detachment is framed as clarity. Instead of digging into why these characters feel trapped, the movie luxuriates in their misery and calls it truth. That's why American Beauty survives more on reputation than re-evaluation. It's remembered as bold because it once shocked, not because it continues to reveal anything new. Its ideas don't deepen over time. They flatten. What was once seen as fearless now feels self-satisfied, like a movie impressed with its own cynicism. The truth is, people pretend to like American Beauty because it once felt transgressive. Admitting it hasn't aged well means admitting that shock and provocation aren't the same as insight. For many viewers, the film is tied to a moment when it felt daring to feel alienated and cynical. Letting go of that admiration can feel like letting go of a younger, more self-serious version of yourself. And that nostalgia is what keeps American Beauty protected. Criticizing it often feels like questioning the seriousness of late 90s cinema itself, as if aging poorly is a personal failure instead of a fair reassessment. But just when you thought the Oscars had learned how discomfort isn't the same as truth, it made weirdness prestigious. Because in our next film, maximalist chaos is mistaken for profundity. Number 4, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. When Everything, Everywhere, All at Once dropped in theaters in 2022, it hit audiences like a cultural lightning bolt. It arrived loud, fast, and emotionally insistent, immediately positioned as something new in a landscape many people felt had grown stale. The response was overwhelming. Viewers didn't just like it, they embraced it, defended it, and elevated it as proof that originality was still possible inside the studio system. The praise is easy to understand. The film is undeniably inventive, packed with visual ideas, genre shifts, and stylistic swings that feel fearless. Its emotional ambition is just as aggressive. Family trauma, immigrant identity, generational guilt, nihilism, love, and cosmic absurdity all collide at once. The multiverse framing gave the movie an elastic playground where anything could happen, and for many people, that felt exhilarating. But this is where excess becomes a problem. The film is overrated not because it lacks ideas, but because it has too many and refuses to let any of them breathe. The same themes are hit again and again, louder each time, until meaning starts to blur. Instead of trusting the audience to sit with an idea, The movie explains it, reinforces it, and then explains it again. The truth is, when every moment is heightened, no moment feels grounded. There's also a tendency to confuse motion with progress. Ideas pile up faster than they resolve. Emotional climaxes arrive before earlier ones have settled. The film wants to be everything everywhere, and in doing so, it often trades clarity for momentum. Chaos becomes a shield against critique. Questioning the film can feel like missing the point rather than evaluating its execution. What starts as bold experimentation slowly becomes noise. I admire the ambition, I really do, but I think the film needed restraint. Not fewer ideas, but more confidence in the ones it already had. The emotional core is there, buried under spectacle, humor, and constant escalation. Instead of trusting stillness, the movie insists on amplification. That insistence is part of why it became untouchable. Criticism quickly turned into dismissal, as if questioning the film meant rejecting creativity itself. The Oscar win sealed that protection, turning enthusiasm into canon. And from that emotional overload, we move next to emotional spectacle on an industrial scale. Number 5. Titanic. Impossible to separate from its cultural dominance, Titanic wasn't just a movie, it was an event, a phenomenon, the kind of film that swallowed pop culture whole and stayed there for years. Even now, criticizing it feels oddly taboo, as if its success settled the argument permanently. The praise is well established, technically it's a landmark. James Cameron's obsession with detail, scale, and physical immersion produced imagery that still holds up decades later. The emotional sweep is broad and carefully engineered, designed to move as many people as possible at the same time. And of course, there's the romance. Jack and Rose framed as tragic, iconic, and eternal. But this is where the reputation starts to outpace the substance. The romance is built on remarkably thin characterization. Jack is less a person than a fantasy of freedom and authenticity. Rose, meanwhile, is often cited, almost universally, as one of the most frustrating romantic leads of the era. Her arc is framed as liberation, but her behavior is frequently passive, contradictory, or emotionally opaque. Many viewers actively dislike Rose, even if they hesitate to say it out loud. The ending is a perfect example of this collective pretense. A lot of people didn't like it. They questioned it, joked about it, and argued about it endlessly, and then quietly accepted it as untouchable because Titanic had already been crowned. The emotional logic of the final sacrifice is shaky, but the film insists on its own righteousness so confidently that disagreement feels like heresy. Emotion in Titanic is driven less by character truth than by spectacle. The tragedy does the heavy lifting. Characters serve the disaster more than they serve themselves. Class politics are present but simplified. Rich equals cruel, poor equals noble, offering moral clarity instead of complexity. The film gestures at systemic inequality but resolves it through personal romance, as if love alone can redeem structural cruelty. The scale also overcompensates for shallow emotional grounding. The bigger the ship, the louder the music, and the longer the sinking, the harder it becomes to question whether the relationships themselves were ever that deep. The craftsmanship overwhelms critique. I still think Titanic is impressive. It's meticulously made, technically astounding, and undeniably effective, but I don't think it's especially insightful. Its reputation survives not because it deepens with time, but because its emotional machinery still works on first contact. Also, people pretend to like Titanic because its cultural footprint is too large to challenge. Criticizing it can feel like arguing with history. Many people even openly dislike Rose, question the ending, or feel manipulated, but still call the film a masterpiece out of habit. And that's the key to why it's overrated. People remember how it made them feel, not what it actually said. And if spectacle can replace depth, what happens when realism enters the picture? Because years after the tragedy that was Titanic, the Academy decided to award a movie that beautified poverty as Best Picture. Number 6. Nomadland. 2021 Oscar Best Picture winner. Nomadland feels quiet, respectful, and humane. It arrives with a softness that signals seriousness immediately. Muted performances, long silences, open landscapes, and a refusal to dramatize suffering in conventional ways. From the start, it positions itself as the kind of film you're supposed to approach carefully, thoughtfully, and almost reverently. That posture earned it enormous praise. Critics celebrated its naturalism, its use of non-actors, and its restrained observational style. Frances McDormand's performance was framed as radically unshowy, a star disappearing into lived experience. The film was lauded for its empathy, its patience, and its refusal to turn economic precarity into spectacle. But this is where Nomadland's reputation begins to exceed its interrogation. The film consistently frames economic hardship as a form of personal wandering rather than a structural trap. Systemic failure, corporate exploitation, vanishing labor protections, the hollowing out of entire communities exists mostly as background texture. Amazon warehouses appear, but their implications are never pressed. The forces that create this nomadic underclass remain strangely abstract. In the film, observation replaces interrogation. The camera watches, but it rarely questions. Poverty becomes poetic. Sunsets over desert campsites and reflective monologues about freedom and grief are rendered as quiet endurance. The film beautifies survival without fully confronting what survival costs. Hardship is rendered dignified but also curiously weightless. This emotional distance is often mistaken for objectivity. In reality, it's a choice, one that smooths over discomfort rather than sitting with it. The film resists judgment so thoroughly that it avoids accountability altogether. It wants to honor its subjects, but in doing so, it insulates the systems that made their lives precarious in the first place. This is also why so many people pretend to enjoy Nomadland more than they actually do. Disliking it feels like admitting a moral failure. The film's tone discourages criticism. If you're bored, unmoved, or frustrated, the implication is that you simply didn't get it. Silence and restraint are treated as inherent depth, making disengagement feel like a personal shortcoming rather than a legitimate response. I think Nomadland is beautiful but frustratingly passive. Its images linger, its atmosphere is carefully composed, but its insights rarely accumulate. By the time it ends, the film feels less like an examination of economic collapse and more like an elegy that refuses to ask who caused the loss. That's why it fits so neatly into the category of overrated Oscar winners. Its prestige comes from what it withholds as much as what it shows, and its reputation is protected by the assumption that quiet equals truth. And from quiet resignation, we move next to the biggest nostalgic myth of the 20th century. Number 7. Forrest Gump. Still one of the most loved films ever made, Forrest Gump is still quoted endlessly, revisited often, and treated as a kind of emotional safe space. For many people, it's less a movie than a memory, something tied to childhood, family, or a vague sense that things used to make more sense. That affection is easy to understand. The film is praised for its warmth, its technical innovation, and its emotional accessibility. Tom Hanks's performance is designed to disarm rather than challenge. The visual effects were groundbreaking at the time. The score guides you gently from moment to moment. Everything about the film is engineered to feel comforting, familiar, and sincere, but that comfort is also where the film becomes overrated. Forrest Gump reframes American history as a sequence of accidental successes. Major political events, civil rights, Vietnam, Watergate, become background scenery for a man who never questions them. History happens around Forrest, never because of him, and never demands anything from him in return. Politics are neutralized through innocence. The film avoids taking responsibility for its worldview by hiding behind simplicity. When Forrest succeeds, it's framed as virtue. When others struggle, it's framed as poor choices or bad luck. Trauma is resolved through optimism, perseverance, or quiet acceptance. Structural forces are softened into fate. The counterculture is where this becomes most visible. Characters who question authority, resist norms, or live messily are punished. Jenny's arc is defined by suffering, addiction, and death, while Forrest's conformity is rewarded with wealth, stability, and emotional fulfillment. Complexity is smoothed into comfort. Dissent becomes noise. Obedience becomes wisdom. This is also why so many people pretend to enjoy Forrest Gump without revisiting it critically. To dislike it feels like rejecting warmth itself. The film has been culturally framed as harmless, even wholesome, which makes critique feel mean-spirited. Nostalgia acts as insulation. If you question the film, you're accused of overthinking something that's just nice. I think Forrest Gump doesn't know what it wants to say, and that's precisely why it's endured. Its refusal to take a clear stance allows audiences to project whatever they want onto it. It feels apolitical while quietly reinforcing a very specific worldview, that history works out, that questioning too much is unnecessary, and that goodness is rewarded without struggle. As an Oscar winner, it represents the Academy at its most comfortable, rewarding a film that looks back warmly, edits out conflict, and reassures us that everything turned out fine. And since nostalgia edits history, what does it ask us to forget? Well, that question is for each of us to answer. These films weren't rewarded for being the best. They were rewarded for being acceptable at the right moment. Each one offered something the Academy could celebrate without feeling threatened by it. Rewatching these movies doesn't ruin them. It just changes the conversation around them. Time strips away the cultural insulation and reveals what was doing the real work: craft, timing, messaging, or myth. This shows that the Oscars don't just reflect taste. By deciding which films become untouchable and which questions stop getting asked, they also shape memory. So which of these still works for you and which doesn't anymore? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this breakdown, like the video and subscribe, and we'll keep the Hollywood discussions coming.